Fourth thing I want to mention about Stalin's accomplishments was the staunch political leadership that he provided through that whole period of time that essentially saw 5 years after his coming to power the global depression and the onset of World War II. Now the West, the United States in particular, likes to tell you that World War II started in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. But we communists don't quite see it that way because Italy invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Before that, Japan was attacking the Soviet Union and landing in Manchuria in China. And so there were a lot of invasions by the so-called Axis powers, those were Germany, Italy, and Japan at that time, that were already in motion. Not to mention that even in Europe, of course, Czechoslovakia was taken in '38, just taken apart by the Germans. So we don't agree with that conception, but point being that from 1924 to 1953, Stalin saw the Great Depression, World War II, and then just before, as he was dying, the Korean War. And he provided the staunch political leadership through this whole time that prepared the Soviet Union to win against Hitler, protect itself, and emerge as a respected superpower. Some of the things he did that were notable in this regard, I'll just mention Spain, sending weapons to Spain in the 1930s, especially the Civil War hit its peak around '36. The only country in the world that was willing to do that, that's the only government in the whole world that sent weapons to the anti-fascist, anti-Nazi side in Spain. And you hear a lot of things now today about Stalin did this and that to mess up the resistance movement in Spain, but this is essentially an argument amongst friends in Spain. There was no other country, not the United States, not France, not England, none of these people that claim to have been such great anti-fascists, none of them sent any actual military aid to the Spanish when they were fighting against fascists armed and trained by the Germans. And if you, to locate this in history for you, may have heard Picasso, and this famous painting, I think it's called the Guernica, is about the first bombing, modern bombing of history. It's about Spain. It's because the Germans had arranged for bombings of the so-called Republicans in Spain, the anti-Nazi side. And that horror occurred and went on without any response from the supposedly great anti-fascists of the United States, France, England, and so on. So that's the kind of staunch person that Stalin was, is that while these others were more powerful but too afraid to fight Hitler, Stalin, put the Russian government out on a limb and fought by proxy in Spain. Another thing that he did, and this gets to why he's so infamous as well as famous, infamous in bourgeois eyes, was his treatment of the internal enemies in the Soviet Union. He called them class enemies. And it was at this time, and the whole time while these attacks on the internal enemies in the Soviet Union were occurring, this took a very staunch hand. It was done with the explanation and justification that the Soviet Union was already engaged in a war, class war internally, but also a war with external enemies. Hitler made it very clear when he wrote his Mein Kampf book that he was coming for Russia. This was already, by the time Stalin was coming to power. Most people believed, Stalin included, that it was a matter of time before World War I resumed, and the Germans came again. It was only a question of when. When are the Germans going to come again? This is the history. World War I is over, but the Russians still expect the Germans to come again, and they're right. And there's a famous quote from 1929 in which Stalin predicted that we have 10 years to industrialize or be crushed. He goes through, he laid it out for his peoples. We have 10 years to get ready, and if we don't do it, we will be crushed. So let me, just one more point about his accomplishments. I'm going to return to this Beevor book. Most of you have heard about these arduous things, the purges, executions, which could have been anywhere from hundreds of thousands into the millions of internal enemies in the Soviet Union, people that we call over here probably dissidents, probably a lot of people who aren't even necessarily that outspoken. but who somehow got in the way, to describe it literally in the words of some of the Soviet people, got in the way of preparing for the war. And we're not at all denying that this happened, that there were executions and people who seemed to be screwing up the war effort were essentially gotten out of the way, that were executed. Now, I'm going to tell you a quote from something, this is coming out now. This is something you won't necessarily read in some of your dusty old books, because this is, again, material that keeps coming out as time goes on and World War II passes. Something you may not have heard is that in the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of all of World War II, 50,000 Russians were armed and fighting on the German side. And this is 6th Army, this is a quote from Villor, 6th Army had over, this is Nazi Army, had over 50,000 Russian auxiliaries attached to its frontline divisions, representing over a quarter of their strength. To give you a description of some of the things that were done. This is something getting into the national question as well. Yeah. Well, thanks. The German officers were so happy with the way that the traitors were performing that they lauded them with extreme praise. And Villor, he openly wonders, during the whole Battle of Stalingrad, why the Germans didn't give up. But I think it's even more amazing the Russians didn't give up. The Russians who were fighting on the Nazi side, and it's not just Russians, I simplify when I say Russians, I should say Soviet peoples. Why did they continue to fight? Well, after a certain point, yes, they had to fight, because they didn't fight and they lost, they knew they were going to be executed. I mean, when you're a traitor and you lose the war, it's pretty obvious that afterwards you're going to be executed for crime. So they expected, that's one reason they fought. But listen to some what the Nazis had to say about some of these traitors. Quote, especially brave were the Tartars, reported an officer in the factory district of Stalingrad. Quote, as anti-tank gunners using a captured Russian weapon, they were proud of every Soviet tank they hit. These fellows were fantastic, unquote. Lieutenant Colonel Matter's group, based on 2 grenadier regiments from the 297th Infantry Division at the southernmost point of the Kessel, contained no fewer than 780, quote, combat-willing Russians, unquote, nearly half his force. That's something you don't hear a lot about. That, yeah, Stalin was known for executing a lot of people, but still, when it came down to it, there were 50,000 Soviet peoples fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad on the wrong side. And as the Stalinists would say after that, in other words, there were 50,000 people who should have been executed before the war got that far, who weren't. And that's a brutal truth. That's a harsh reality to accept. Now, why do we say that? Well, it's a life or death situation. It's something that we, in our comfort right now in 1999, don't often face. We start to see a little bit in the Balkans what goes on with ethnic cleansing and the brutality of that kind of war. But the Russians, let's not forget, a good estimate of the number of people they lost in the war was 27 million people. 27 million. When you talk about the Jewish Holocaust, we're talking about 6 million people. That's like one of the most horrific events in history. We're talking about 27 million Russians in the same period of time. So we know, wow, this is something that we in 1999 probably can't even relate to on any level. Just can't relate to it. So I'm here telling you some very harsh things. Yes, Stalin executed at least hundreds of thousands of people in his reign. That's the low-end estimates, and some people will tell you millions, and I'll get into that later. But we have to look at the context that this was done in. Russia, the Soviet Union was always between a rock and a hard place. 1924, only a couple years had passed before the imperialist armies had withdrawn from the Soviet Union. What do I mean, imperialist armies? I mean English troops on Soviet soil. I mean French military invasion. This was going on in the Civil War of the USSR, and the Russians remember this, and they're right. The Germans are coming. They're coming again.